this subsequent part of this, let's call it what's in a name.
All right.
And I will tell you why that is significant. As I mentioned, there was a National Heart and Lung Institute, which had 3 divisions: heart, lung, and blood. Now, it had an advisory council, which every institute must have, made up of non-governmental experts in the field that had final advice to the institute as to which grants or contracts or programs would be funded. Now, the advisory council that was present when I arrived had literally the giants of the cardiovascular community. For example, Michael DeBakey, well known, and the lung community had the giants of the lung community. Julius Comroe being probably the dean of respiratory medicine at that time was a member, as were probably 5 or 6 others of that. Now, these members were appointed by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and he naturally chose experts in heart and experts in lung.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the blood was a new division. There was no appointment made in blood, but there were 2 outside people serving, who one was a resident and one was a junior faculty member with no national presence. And they were wonderful people, but in the scheme of things had no clout.
Mm-hmm.
And so naturally the heart and lung community interpreted the 15% allocation. No, it should be no less than 15%. They interpreted it as no more than 15%. And this was troubling for 2 reasons. For 2 major reasons. One, that there were already programs in existence which had to be funded. As I mentioned, the sickle cell, the transfusion medicine, and the hemophilia program. This cut into the availability of funds for investigator-initiated research.
Mm-hmm.
Now, blood is easier to study than is either the heart or the lung. You can't biopsy the heart or the lung as easily as you can get a sample of blood. So blood really, first of all, it now had a focus in the NIH, so it attracted more applications to that institute. Before that, they were divided in arthritis and metabolic diseases, in the Cancer Institute, in the Infectious Disease Institute, and blood being most easily studied also formed the basis of studies in, say, genetics, in immunology, in molecular biology, and all of these grants now came into the blood division. In order to be funded, they had to pass study sections who'd assign priority scores, and that was true in heart, lung, as well as blood. Well, it turned out you had to have a much higher priority in the hematology study sections to be funded than you needed in heart and lung. And I did have some ability to review grants in all 3 areas, and the ones in blood were far superior to many in heart and lung. Not to say that heart and lung was not important, but it was so much easier to study. So
and the funding was so skewed.
Pardon?
And the funding was so skewed.
And the funding was skewed in some ways. So I felt that an institute really should have a similar pay line for priority scores across the board and not have one be required very much higher than the other two. So what to do? It seemed to me that one thing that came to mind, and I don't know where the idea came from, but I became aware that the National Institute of Mental Health had just been established out of other programs, and there was a director of the National Institute of Mental Health. So I went to him and asked him what it took to make the National Institute of Mental Health. And as I recall, I don't know where I got the ideas, but it needed three things. It needed, first of all, spokespersons for the blood community who could convince Congress of its importance. Then it needed a sponsor in Congress. And finally, it needed a lobbyist to put everything together. So, to attack the first problem, to get spokespersons, I had a wonderful colleague named Robert Weed from the University of Rochester in New York. And he was gung-ho, and he knew a congressman. As I recall, his name was Barnaby, but I'm not certain right now. He was a member of the House, and he became the locus in Congress to start the bill. Then I flew out to Utah to talk to Max Winthrop, who was the Dean of American Hematologists, and said, let's put together programs of people who, in the blood community, who could be spokespersons to say what studies of blood have accomplished and what the promise is for the future. And along with others, he undertook that task and really combined the efforts of some 20 people who were really the forerunners in the 20th century of advances in blood to develop their particular area. This was then published in a book, and the book is a landmark book of the advances of hematology in the 20th century. The book is called Blood, Pure and Eloquent, which is a quote from John Donne, the poet of 17th century England. Obviously, I have a copy of that book, happily inscribed by Max Winthrop. And so the second part, so we had two links. Now we had a sponsor in Congress, we had spokespersons in the community, and they could be resource people for education. And finally, I needed a lobbyist. So I learned from the Hemophilia Society that they got a program going by hiring a lobbyist named John Gruppenhoff. This is not Abramoff. What was Abramoff's first name?
Jack.
But
Jack.
Jack Abramoff. John Gruppenhoff was wonderful to work with, dedicated to the process, and within about 9 or 12 months, I don't remember exactly, the bill came up for a vote to make it the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and it passed unanimously in the Senate, and 370 out of 375 votes in the House. Now, among other things that this did was it cost $200,000 to change the stationery and the logos. And it took some time to become effective. the sadness was that as this process was going on, Bob Weed in Rochester developed a brain tumor. And he was so supportive, and he was fading fast, that I got Jack Lyons, my deputy, my executive person to have them make up a new logo with heart, lung, and a big blood to make it dedicated to Robert Weed. I took it up to Rochester. He liked it. His wife loved it. And so he could see the results of his efforts before he passed away,
wow.
which he did shortly after. His wife and I continued to communicate for decades later. Every Christmas, she was very eager in the chorus of the Rochester community, the choir, I mean, and she traveled worldwide. But I've stopped corresponding with her about 5 or 6 years ago. This was a very sad outcome. There were other consequences. The director of the Heart Division, Bob Levy, had become, I need to back up, Ted Cooper, in fact, left the Heart and Lung Institute to become Assistant Secretary for Health about a week after I joined the Blood Division. So the person who hired me no longer was there, and my immediate boss became the Deputy Director, Bob Ringler, and I worked with him. But then about 1976, after the bill had been passed, a permanent director was appointed, and that was Robert Levy, who became the director of the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And not long after, he called me in and he said, "Ernie, you know, I can't support you or your program. My community is not happy with the name change and felt that it did not want to have the competition for funds, for the allocation of funds." I assured him and pointed out that the bill that changed the law to make it the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute also increased the allocation for the Institute as a whole. Be that as it may, that was not persuasive in any way, and Bob continued to say he had difficulty in firing me because I was an officer in the United States Public Health Service, but I could no longer remain as director because any proposals that I would have to him, say to hire another individual or to promote an individual in my staff, would not be honored. So I could not make any commitments with any assurance that they could be honored. So I must say tearfully, I resigned. But the person who first took me to lunch after my resignation was Carol Lewis, a lovely woman with whom I had worked on the heart and lung, on the blood aspect of the 5-year plan, and she was with an organization called Booz Allen Hamilton, and they were responsible for putting together the 5-year plan for the Institute. A lovely person who became a friend of my daughters and the family, and I remained in touch with her for some years after we left Bethesda. So that was an outcome. And it was...
When did you resign?
I resigned in, at the beginning, at the end of, I'll be very specific. I was asked, I was given no support at the beginning of November of '75. There was a advisory committee meeting up in 3 weeks after that, and we both agreed that nothing should be said before that advisory committee meeting because I needed to represent the blood division and present its program and its budget and so forth. And we both agreed that Wolf Zulzer, who was a giant, who I had been able to recruit as my deputy director, would become the new director. And so after the end of November of '75, I announced my resignation. And when Lou Barker,
It's okay, sorry.
Excuse me, when Lou Barker, who was director of the Division of Blood and Blood Products at FDA, learned of this. He, as you recall, had been a member of the US-USSR exchange and blood transfusion and hepatitis, a program that we made 4 visits to the Soviet Union, and they visited us 4 times. He was a most supportive member of me during the time. When he heard I was available, they established a position called the Deputy Director for Research in the Blood Division at FDA and offered me the job. And he said, "Ernie, you kept talking about adenine in Russia all the time. We don't have it here. Why don't you take the responsibility in FDA to put together the data necessary for us to license adenine?"
I had no idea that you weren't still at Blood doing that. You know, head of Blood doing that. So
No,
I didn't know you had a job change then.
Yeah, I had a job change to the FDA, and so the next a large part of my effort at the FDA Blood Division was to gather together the military, the manufacturers, the Red Cross, other blood banking organization, and to put together a panel and a presentation of all the outstanding issues that needed to be resolved. And that was successful, and the panel was put together in '78, and I have the transcript, of course, available. And then by '79, adenine was added as a supplement to
finally extend
extend the shelf life of
Finally.
blood. Initially for 35 days and ultimately for 42 days.
So if you had still been, if you hadn't had the run-in essentially with the guy, adenine might still not be licensed in the States.
Well, there would have been another product champion of some time, but anyway, that gave me an opportunity to pull together all the loose ends that were required. The Bureau of Biologics by that time had given up the mandate to regulate what's in the bag, so that what's in the bag and what bag itself was now the purview of the FDA, so it all could be done. It still required a champion from the industry to put together a proposal, and as I said, the pressure was high on because Tippi Greenwald, the dean of transfusion medicine and head of the Red Cross program that managed 50% of the blood supply in the United States, or 6 million bags. So two companies both competed. That was Fenwal and McGaw, and they both actually produced bags, and they both became licensed distributors. So one of the outcomes was that the good thing of losing the job, if you will, was to get adenine into the system. And another very nice part of the job was that because of my position at the FDA and the NIH, one of the people, there was a Council of Europe subcommittee on transfusion practices, and it was composed of 17 or 18 members. It was a matter of 17 showed up. If Greece showed up, Cyprus didn't. If Cyprus did, Greece didn't. But all in all, there were 17 members. But the delegate from Switzerland had met me and had said, well, we really need to know what the United States is doing. And so I wasn't an official member, but I was the official observer from the United States to attend this subcommittee, which was a week of meetings once a year in one of the 17 countries. The first one was in Reykjavik, Iceland. The second one was in Brussels. I think the third one was Frankfurt in 70. The first one was 76. The second one was 77, I think, in Brussels. The third one was Frankfurt, where Eve attended with me, where we met the Seidels again, which I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. They had introduced adenine in Germany a decade before. And the fifth one was in, the fourth one
was in Athens. That's the one I remember.
Well, my lovely daughter Carol, at age 18, accompanied me, met all the people in the committee. There were so she had a contact in every country which she visited by herself on a Europass after I let her off at the train station in Athens with tears in both of our eyes.
I remember the Engelfrieds. It was the Engelfrieds, right? Is that the right name?
The Engelfrieds were
in Switzerland, in
No,
Bern.
they were in...
No, they're Holland.
They were
they're
in
Netherlands.
Holland.
What was the name of the family in Switzerland?
Per
and Susanna...
No, yeah, he was in Switzerland, but he wasn't the person who initially suggested that they have an observer from the United States. The last one was in Bilthoven in the Netherlands in 1980. And this was a wonderful experience for me. The downside, in a sense, was that each of the other delegates had to only prepare themselves in one or two topics, but I had to give the American position in all the agenda items.
So were you already at FDA for the whole thing, or was part of it you were still representing blood?
I was appointed, actually, as an observer while I was still in...
Head of blood?
At blood, at the National Institutes of Health. But the first meeting took place when I was already the director at the...
Ernie,
the deputy director at FDA.